Hey, listener, and thank you for tuning in to episode 82 of DoubleDM today. As per the title of this episode, you can see we are talking about dungeon crawls today, and especially how to make them a more engaging and rewarding experience for your players. Dungeon crawls can be a tedious and long process that will drag on for players, but fear not, because we sat down to discuss dungeon crawls the way we do with everything else. With dungeon crawls for us, it's all about the exploration and mystery inherent to exploring a dungeon for an extended period of time. So that is what we are focusing on today. So sit back and relax, and let's chat about making your TTRPGs better in episode 82, how to make your dungeon crawls more engaging.
Hello and welcome back to DoubleDM episode 82. With me, as per usual, is my lovely co-host Emil, and I am Niels. So, Emil, how are you doing today?
I am doing pretty fine, I would say. It's been a good week so far, and it promises to be one of the greatest weeks in a long time.
Mm-hmm. Why is that?
Well, that is because, first of all, today, on Tuesday, the 23rd of August, I am wardening, I think is the right term for it, a one-shot of Mothership for 4 of my friends, which you are a part of.
Mm-hmm.
First of all. Then on Thursday, I'm gonna play a session of The Dark Eye with my usual Thursday group. On Friday, it is planned that we play our underwater D&D campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And then on Friday as well, which is now after this episode has been released, the discussion panel, What is Roleplay Anyway? Where we are gonna raise funds. And yeah, we're also gonna have a fun discussion with a few panelists that I am very excited to speak to, and I'm very excited to be part of that. And after that, I have to get up at 4:30 a.m. or at 4:30 a.m. my train goes at the Berlin Central Station to Cologne, where I'm gonna have a little mini stressful vacation in Cologne this weekend. So yeah, I'm on my way to vacation after that panel at 2. The panel ends at 2 a.m. After that, I have 2 hours to get to the train station to go to my vacation for the weekend. So that's gonna be a lot. So, Niels, you had TTRPG sessions since we last talked.
Yes, I had one.
So please talk to me about it. What happened? How was it? And everything else you want to share.
Well, it was one of the most fun sessions I had in a very, very long time.
Oh, okay.
Because we played for 8 hours. Usually this group only plays for 4 to 5.
Okay, how did that happen? Was it just because you said, okay, yeah, we can go longer, or was it planned to go 8 hours?
No, it wasn't planned at all. That's the fun part of it.
Okay.
We said, hey, why not play D&D? We all have time, so let's go for it spontaneously. And then we just started playing, said, okay, let's play our usual 4 to 5 hours. But then we were so invested and into the story, all the players were, and the DM as well. And so we just kept playing, and suddenly it was 10 p.m. And we were like, wait, where the fuck did the day go? But it was amazing.
I mean, that's good. I have my reservations about overextending D&D or general TTRPGs, personally. But obviously, if everyone's fine with it, you should do it.
Yeah.
So, okay, what happened in those 8 hours? Because 8 hours are a long time, and I can tell you from my usual 8-hour groups.
Well, where do I start?
At the beginning, hopefully.
Yeah. Where is the beginning? We started in a tavern this session and had some inter-character talks and some preparations because we wanted to visit a abandoned castle run over by goblins, orcs, and hobgoblins and whatever else there is. Because our employer was kidnapped to that castle. We were tasked to bring him along with, or bring his supplies along for some excavation he wanted to do.
Okay.
And then he traveled separately but got kidnapped by some goblins or whatever. And then we gathered some supplies to start an expedition towards that castle because it was 1.5 days per foot away from the city we were in. And on the way we found tracks of a displacer beast being hunted. So we said, okay, maybe let's not anger this thing. Just go to the castle. There will be enough trouble already. Maybe sometime else or whatever. And once we were at the castle, we briefly ducked out of the way of a patrol coming out of the castle. They were searching for other people or just be a security detail or whatever. We tried to find a way into that castle, but we wouldn't want to knock on the front door, right? Like, who wants to infiltrate something by going straight through the front door? That doesn't sound like a good idea at all. So we went around some intense climbing checks later. we finally arrived on the castle walls and found a breach in the inner walls of the castles of the castle, and went in there, fought some hobgoblins, I think were there, and then some bugbear, self-proclaimed King Borg or something, who wanted to rule over this land and had kidnapped our employer. Why ever he kidnapped that employer is still out for us to figure out, because he didn't give up any information. Not that we didn't try, but with that climbing around the castle wall and finding that breach, we more or less skipped the most parts of the dungeon that the DM prepared for us, because we didn't go through the whole castle itself, but basically went right through to the boss encounter. And that was a intense fight. Was really, really intense. All of us were on single-digit health at the end, and I think 2 went down. 1 or 2. Went down. But yeah, then we got our employee back to the city and not comforted him, but patched him up a bit, and then went back to the castle to clear it out for good, because this goblin tribe, hobgoblins and whatnot, were causing trouble in these lands. Once we were back at the castle, we have seen that these goblins had one magic user with them that was trying to summon some devils, sorry. And yeah, that's a good thing to stop. And then some roleplay moments later, blah blah blah, we went again through the woods, followed the traces of the displacer beast that we saw the day before, because one of our characters is really bound to nature and tries to save everything that isn't attacking him personally or his group. And we found a small cave where some dragon druid housed and created this underground safe haven for endangered animals. And he took us through a water pool in there, and we dove down several hundred meters, and suddenly we're in kind of the Underdark, but not really. A really, really big open cave with a crevice leading or splitting this cave in half, with a big golden, slightly yellowish orange glowing disc hanging all over it, and putting all of this cave into a sun rising glow. And it's completely overgrown with any sort of vegetation, and weird animals that we have never seen before went there. And then he just dropped some names on us. He called us weird names that we've never heard us called before.
Okay.
And yeah, and that's where we ended the session.
Sounds creepy.
Yes, it does. Yes, hell yes, it does. I can't wait to play more, because why the fuck was I called the Chosen of the Elder? I don't know. My character doesn't know, and I just want to find out. But yeah, that's what we did for the 8 hours.
Okay. Sounds like a very interesting sessions, or like an interesting session.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. So, you all got called names. Not the bad kind of calling names, but the creepy one. That's interesting. I am looking forward to hearing what happens next for that group. It sounds as if that group has itself a mystery in their connection. Maybe. I don't know.
Hell yeah. I mean, the names were Chosen of the Elder, Bearer of the Dark Gift, and Dragonkin.
Okay.
So yeah, Dragonkin was the most obvious of that, because he has a pet dragon as this dragon riding ranger subclass. I forgot the name exactly. But the Bearer of Dark Gifts and Chosen of the Elder, I want to know. I just want to know, okay?
Players always want to know, but DMs need to hold back sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's gonna devolve further for you guys. Especially Bearer of Dark Gifts doesn't sound so positive as a name at first.
No, it does not.
But we will see. So, anything else you want to discuss about that group? Anything you else want to tell me? Because if not, we can go into the episode today.
Not yet. Let's see where all of these weird things will go.
Sure, we've recapped our weeks. We talked a little bit about what we have coming up and what we look forward to, what we had fun for the week. So I think we should jump into episode 82 of DoubleDM, which is gonna focus on dungeon crawling. Hey everyone, and welcome to the mid-roll of the show. If you are enjoying the show and content, why not subscribe or follow the show right now on whichever platform you are listening on so you can stay up to date with all episode releases. Then, next you can search us up on social media at DoubleDM Pod or click the links in the info box of this episode to find our social media channels and follow us there if you want to stay up to date with all scheduling information and episode announcements. If you follow us on Twitter, you will also get a plethora of social media posts as I spend way too much time on that platform. But hey, I have funny conversations with people like you and post memes, so that's a great thing. And lastly, if you want to help the show out even further, rate and review us on your platform. A quick 5-star rating or a few sentence review really gives us the feedback we need to improve the show and help other people find our show too. And hey, you can also just tell a friend about the fun you had learning with us and get them to listen in too. Also, we want to say that our show has open advertisement slots for you to book. Just head on over to our Twitter or email address doubledmpod@gmail.com to get into contact with us about getting your content shown on our show. Thank you for listening to this mid-roll, and now back to the show.
And with that, welcome back to the episode. And Emil, last week we talked a bit about that I have this underground city exploration, where I wanted to add some drama and action to that.
Yeah, that is true.
I wanted to come back to that a bit because it kind of is also a dungeon thing, but just as a whole city, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And would you consider this type of adventure a dungeon crawl or not?
It's hard to say, right? The term dungeon means a lot of different things to TTRPG players, especially with the relevance and presence of Dungeons and Dragons, where some really enjoy a lot of dungeons and some do not enjoy any kind of dungeons. And there's this big debate about what is a dungeon, what is not a dungeon. We already talked about what we both count as dungeons. Some people say a dungeon is everywhere where adventure is held. And while I can understand that opinion, I do not share it. It's your opinion. I do not want to bash it in anything, but I think that's not really helpful to when we're talking about dungeons, right? The thing is, if someone asks, hey, can I get some advice for dungeons? And your first thing is, well, a dungeon is everything where adventure is held, then that person is not going to have the advice they are probably looking for. What I really think of a dungeon is the structure that is filled with adventure, yes, mystery, combats, and what all, right? Be it a stronghold, be it a castle, be it an underground dungeon, prison or something, be it a vault underground to protect magical artifacts or whatever. But basically, any confined structure where you explore is a dungeon for me. It doesn't necessarily have to be hostile, but it's often supposed to be hostile to the party. But it doesn't have to be for me. But that's a dungeon for me. And that is, if you put it like that, you could make an argument that your city underground is dungeon. You could also make a saying that it's not a dungeon, but is rather a location to be explored with many little dungeons in it. Obviously, I don't know what's going on with your game, only from what you tell me, but I assume that there are places where the players can explore really far into that one single place in that city, right?
Exactly.
I don't know if there's a palace or anything, but if that palace is a thing, that palace would, in my opinion, be a real dungeon. The city would be more of a location that is a dungeon.
Yeah.
It's hard, right? It's hard to define because everyone has a different definition, and it's hard to say this is definitely not a dungeon and this is definitely a dungeon, because I get why the lines are blurred for many people. But yeah, the definition for me is a structure that is kind of confined where players can adventure and explore.
Yeah, I see it the same way, because I would define my underground city as as you said, environment that is to be explored, but not a dungeon per se. There are dungeons within this underground city. The same way I wouldn't necessarily say the whole of the Underdark, for example, is a dungeon, because it's just a place underground. So it would be the city. So I kind of see it as a environment where some dungeons will be that my players can then explore to their own extent as much as they want. And then the question becomes, what is actually a dungeon crawl? When does exploring a dungeon actually become a dungeon crawl?
That is a funny thing for me, because for me, a session in a dungeon isn't necessarily a dungeon crawl, right? Just going into a dungeon, for whatever you have to find it as, it's not necessarily a dungeon crawl. But I understand, obviously, that the term dungeon has just been defined as something where you go in and explore. So everything where you go and explore could be a dungeon crawl. But for me, a dungeon crawl is an extended period of time in the dungeon.
Yeah.
Now, you can define that however you want. But for me, the extended period of time is basically more than a full session, or roughly a full session is a dungeon crawl, because a quick go in, get out isn't a dungeon crawl, right? If you say your palace is a dungeon, if, for example, the rogue goes on a quick solo mission to steal something and goes into the noble's estate, steals the thing the players need, and gets out again, that's not a dungeon crawl. Even though the noble's estate could be seen as a dungeon if your players go through the front door or go in somewhere else and start exploring the place.
Yeah.
Right? This noble is a cultist, whatever, and the rogue goes quickly in, steals an amulet, and gets out again. That is not a dungeon crawl. But if the players get in and start fighting their way through this noble's estate or whatever, or go exploring for a longer time, that could be a dungeon crawl. So yeah, for me, it's hard to define what a dungeon crawl really is, because it's basically, for me, just an extended period of time in a dungeon. I don't know if you have a different definition, if you have maybe a more rigid definition, because that would probably be helpful, but I cannot come up with one right now.
Yeah, the thing is, the way we define dungeons, it's hard to completely create a rigid definition of what a dungeon crawl is, because everything that is basically a structure could be a dungeon for us. So depending on the time the players spent in there.
See, the thing for me is, in a dungeon crawl, is right, the exploring of that dungeon.
Yeah.
That is the best point I can make, right? You have a dungeon, you define it as a dungeon, however you define dungeons. If your players go exploring that place, it's a dungeon crawl.
Yeah, and I think the exploring part is the big thing here, because if you already know what's in this place, I wouldn't necessarily call it a dungeon crawl, because you already know what the fuck you're going into.
It's about the mystery in it.
Exactly.
A little bit. It's about finding out what is in here, exploring, right? You do not have a map of this place, basically, and you map your way through, right? Exploring room after room after room.
Yeah, the unknown is a big part in a dungeon crawl, I think.
Yeah, I think too, as well, right? For me, the dungeon crawl is a structure that, right, isn't necessarily hostile to the players, but involves them kind of interacting with the place, with the environment they're in a lot.
Oh yeah.
Traps are the most easy example of that. In a dungeon, you should have traps. Easy as pie, right? Understandable. Everyone gets that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be traps. It could be puzzles. It could be guards the players need to convince to let them through or something. But they need to engage with the environment they're in. And the environment they're in now also means things placed in that environment, like guards that are people that are somehow meant to stop the players or engage with the players in some way or another. So yeah, it's a lot about being in a confined space for me and engaging with that space for an extended period of time, exploring this place. Yeah. That's a dungeon crawl for me, right? It doesn't sound really all that much and even that interesting, but some of the dungeon crawls can be very, very interesting.
Oh yeah, they can be. Do you like dungeon crawls, or do you like to use dungeon crawls usually?
So that depends a lot on the group I'm playing with, because I can run a dungeon crawl. I can do it. I can create a dungeon. I can create long dungeons. I can create deep dungeons. I can create cool dungeons, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. At least I've never had a player go, this dungeon is bullshit. Yeah, so that's a good plus.
From what I experienced myself, you create awesome dungeons.
Yeah, and the thing is, I obviously look out for the group. So if I have players that do not enjoy the more rules-heavy side of the game, I'm not saying that they don't like engaging with the rules. I'm saying that some people, for example, in D&D, have told me that while they get how to do combat and how to do spells, they get bored quickly if we do that for way too long, right? We play, for example, in one of my games, we play 8 hours. If of those 8 hours, 5 hours would be combat, my players and I as well would be tired the fuck out from the game, because we've been rolling so many dice, we've been using so many features, we've been using so many spells, and while that is part of the game, and I'm not saying that it's bad, it's still tiring.
Oh yeah.
So that's the thing. Dungeon, most of the time, more often requires you to engage with the game in a more rigid way, like combat or for like traps, like puzzles or whatever. While pure role-playing encounters obviously do not. So that's the thing. I look out, is my group the one that actually enjoys this more rigid style? And yes, if so, I can create more dungeons. And if they take long in the dungeon, then yes, I do run dungeon crawls. Do I enjoy them? I mean, they're there.
Yeah.
I enjoy more to basically let my players run in an open world, because the dungeon isn't necessarily an open world part. It's a rigid, defined structure. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have every room mapped, but it's not an open world.
Yeah.
It's not an overland structure where your players can go to every single town they want to go. Because the dungeon is way smaller than a town. I enjoy more of that style of my players traveling and engaging with threats in different parts of the world, engaging with different threats in different environments, with different people, and that type of stuff I enjoy more. So that's what I run more. But I do not have a problem with running a dungeon crawl. I do use them if I think they are very useful to what I want to do. For example, my players need a specific magical artifact. That's a great dungeon crawl because it has a go, and then I can do that because then my players understand why we have to go through this underground structure to retrieve a magic item and then 2 sessions later have a magic item. That is where I'm at with dungeon crawls. They're fun, but I don't run them too often.
I usually see them as a tool to break up the pace in my games or to change pace.
Yeah.
Because in one of my games, I have 5 people. 2 are very heavily invested in combat all the time. 1 is split 50-50 and 2 are more of a role play and exploring kind of deal. And so it's hard to balance that. But now in the underground city, I think I can manage to do both by breaking up the pace with a relatively short in comparison dungeon crawl, maybe like 3 to 4 hours or something. 1 session of a dungeon crawl and then some exploration and then another combat experience or something like this, to break up the pace of not just exploring, but also a bit of the more rules heavy engaging with the game kind of style.
Yeah.
To make everyone happy, like you said, to engage the group in a way that everyone likes.
Yeah, it's the first thing is always know your group, right? Know who you're playing with. Ask them if you have to. Would you have a problem if we go through a dungeon, right? Because one of my players, my current adventure, or the adventure we just finished in one of my games, was involving a lot of dungeons. But I made them very short dungeons. They were simple. They were more of a place where the players go in the middle of the session and are out at the end of a session again. So roughly 3 hours of dungeons. Yes, that could have been considered dungeon crawl. They fought traps, puzzles, monsters, and boss fights and what all. But there was a lot of more about exploration in that, for example. I made the dungeons about exploration, right? And that's the same for you. You have players that enjoy exploration and social encounters or something. Make the dungeon about exploration at all. It doesn't have to be a lot of combat or a lot of traps, but it can be that you put in a library where you put in a few books that have a very specific knowledge the players want, or murals on the walls that depict certain things, strange magic that they have to interact with. A puzzle could still be a very interesting thing, especially roleplay puzzles. We talked about that in our puzzle episode, but if you get a roleplay puzzle in your dungeon, my group loves these. They are way cooler than these riddles of I walk on 4 legs, then on 2, then on 3 or something.
Yeah.
These are fun for some of my players, but some of my other players really are not good at these and they hate them. But what they all do enjoy apparently is roleplay puzzles, where they have to roleplay their way out of it. That is fun. And that is roleplay and also a little bit of exploration, right? Puzzles are about exploration. I think generally the exploration pillar is badly defined in D&D.
Yeah.
Especially also because D&D has no rules for it and just says, yeah, it's there. I think if we would rename the pillar to mystery or discovery or something, it would make a lot more sense to some people. Or at least I think it would. And hey, the thing is, if your dungeon is about discovery and exploration and mystery, that is still a different dungeon than a combat dungeon, right? And since in your game, it's about the ancient dragon race, right? And the players are kind of on track to find out, I don't know, what happened and how to prevent the thing that the doom of the world, right?
Basically, yeah.
So that's perfect. Make an exploration-based dungeon that your exploration players can do and then have one fight in it. or two for the fighting, for the more rules engaging players. And also because D&D likes combat. But especially also in the combat, you could have exploration, right? But the dungeon can be made about exploration. I think you can cater dungeons to a lot of different play styles. And I think that's why even if your players say they do not enjoy dungeons, that just means they've never met a dungeon that is catered to their favorite experience of the game.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think dungeons are, as they are so badly in quotation marks defined, can be a lot of different things. And with that, meaning that you can make a lot of different dungeons for a lot of different people.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I see dungeons and dungeon crawls as a tool. And because of the loose definition, this just fits perfectly.
Yeah.
You have all the different types of things that you can do with a dungeon and use it exactly for that reason. Just know what reason you are using your dungeon for and then cater that dungeon to exactly that reason. Because it depends on what reason you have. The dungeon crawl feels different, obviously, and is lived in differently depending on the inhabitants of the currently of the dungeon or the traps or the puzzles or whatever. It all kind of is shaped by the type of dungeon that you have and therefore shapes the way of the dungeon crawl, what it feels like, what it's supposed to do, and their goal and the whole way how to go about them. Because a completely whole combat dungeon crawl that is just focused on that, clearing out this dungeon, for example, feels completely different than finding the library somewhere in this huge underground ancient wizarding school, for example. It feels completely different. One is more, okay, where the fuck is the next enemy? The other is, might there be magical traps? What keeps us from just walking there and finding a way? And this just completely feels different.
Yeah, one of my favorite dungeons is an illusion dungeon. So I haven't run this yet, but I have the idea of, because one of my gods in my world is a god of trickery, of illusions. The temples of this god are basically places you never find. And if you find them, you're never gonna find your way out of them again, basically. They're this
fun.
Very much playtimey, kind of a little bit horror-y carnival experience of a mirror maze with fake walls and that type of stuff, where if you're smart enough, you can get out. But beware making a mistake here, because that just means you never know where you're going.
Yeah.
It's very much a labyrinth that just says, haha, fuck you, because the wall you just used to know where you're going is a fake wall and it's now turning and something like that, right? It's a dungeon that doesn't make sense. I know that's super hard to run, because if you want to make a dungeon seem fair and fun, it has to somehow make sense. So I haven't run this, but that's kind of what I want to run. It's very much in the same manner. One of the favorite dungeon inspirations I've ever had was the mansion in Demon Slayer, where with the bang of the drums, the demon could change the layout of the mansion, turn it, twist it, and all of that stuff.
That's awesome.
Like, these dungeons are fun because the whole dungeon is an exploration experience. And right, Niels, I'm just gonna say this. I don't know is that group the one you're playing today as we're recording?
No, it is not.
Perfect, because if you do not have a dungeon yet, make such a dungeon, because that is the type of dungeon I would love to enjoy. I would love to hear about how people run them. I know that they are very hard to run. I'm not gonna lie. These dungeons where the whole dungeon changes are hard to run, because you still need to have some sense in them. They still need to make sense in some way, because if they do not make sense, it quickly becomes the problem of randomness, which is bad for players, because randomness just means they cannot figure it out, and that's gonna lead to frustration, and you do not want frustration at your table.
Yeah.
So a dungeon that somehow poses a riddle question or something at the beginning that the players have to answer through exploring the dungeon. Like, the mansion changes, so they need to figure out what it means that the mansion changes. Or the dungeon, I don't know, talks to them in some weird ways, and they need to figure out what the dungeon is actually saying to them to actually find their way out or where they want to go or something.
Yeah, or like with the Demon Slayer example, depending on what kind of sound there is.
Yeah, exactly.
What type of movement then happens. And then you can predict what is going to happen and stuff like that. I will definitely build one of this in the city. Hell yeah. And I will tell everyone on this podcast about it, because amazing.
Please do as soon as you can.
Yeah, I have to get to crafting it then. Maybe on the weekend.
Maybe.
I'm hyped.
Okay, going further, what is something else we can discuss about dungeon crawls? And any other questions? Because, right, you're running a dungeon crawl in, I don't know, a few weeks in that campaign or whatever. At least that's why we're here, right? So any other questions dungeons? Anything else you want to talk about?
Kind of related to the illusion type of dungeon. I wanted to talk about a bit about the environments of a dungeon.
Yeah, sure, let's do that.
Because I think a dungeon itself, sure, is a structure in some way, shape, or form. But as we established with the illusion dungeon, it doesn't always have to be that rigid.
Yeah.
And I think making it a bit more of a organic living thing could also be fun, or to change up the environment mid-dungeon. Or if you have the classic definition of a dungeon, suddenly there is no classic room anymore, but just a crevice that leads down to a lava flow, something like this, just to keep the environment more interesting.
Yeah, I think, right, what I do when I do prep dungeons is, especially if they're longer dungeons, I write down a lot of different descriptions for rooms. Like, I just write down a lot of different bullet points so I can describe rooms, so that I can fill the dungeon with rooms that I write. Because the 5-room dungeon, for example, having an entrance, a riddle, a combat, an ending, and loot or something, it doesn't mean that you only can have 5 rooms in your dungeon.
Yeah.
There can be a lot of different rooms in between those, but they're not relevant. So I write down a lot of different things that describe it. And that's why I think the environment question is an interesting question, because that's exactly it, right? I write down a lot of descriptions that fit the dungeon theme, but I can also change those up, especially if my players have, I don't know, completed 3 rooms. The dungeon changes. The dungeon is different. Maybe it's an old dungeon and therefore broken. That means the lava flow is there. Or, for example, the environment with your dragon dungeons, again, because, right, they're about dragons, those dungeons. I don't want to, obviously, dictate what you should do, but hey, if I've ever seen the place for a dungeon with 5 different themes, all akin to a different draconic element, fire, lightning, poison, acid, ice, that's the place to do it. That's the place to create dungeons that have some kind of dragon elemental attachment to the environment. Lava flows, acid pools, that type of stuff.
Yeah, I might have to change that up a bit, because in my world there are 7 dragon overlords that once ruled the world, each regarding to a different category of a dragon, basically. But yeah, that sounds amazing. Just focusing on a theme, or every section of the dungeon is basically focused on one theme of a dragon.
Yeah, right.
I thought of one thing.
Okay.
Because I have 7 dragons, and this is one of the ancient cities of one of those 7 dragons.
Okay.
Maybe the dungeon as a whole has the theme of the dragon that once ruled the city, but has 6 different other sections that each represent one of the others.
I don't know, maybe temples, right?
Yeah.
Because they were worshipped like gods or anything. Very akin to actually what happened in one of my recent campaigns where I play, where we entered, right, the dragon globe, the different plane of existence, basically, for dragons. And there was one of the god dragons had their city, basically, and the pyramid, where they ruled. That was their palace, a huge giant pyramid that could fit dragons. And since he was some kind of an emperor, and there were 11 other god dragons, there was a room in that dungeon that was big enough to house all 12 of these god dragons, I think, to have councils and discuss things. And obviously big throne rooms, because the dragon needs to fit in there, right? And that was a dungeon, even though it wasn't necessarily, like, we didn't explore it totally, but there was a lot of different secrets in it that we explored that all were fit for dragons, because obviously it was fit for dragons. So yeah, that just reminds me of that. But yeah, obviously, if one of your dragons, I don't know, this dragon overlord has whatever theme to them, you probably have some stuff written down. I don't want to ask you, because maybe your players listening and don't know yet. So they have these themes written down. These themes need to be embedded everywhere in the town. Be it a symbol, right? That needs to be everywhere. Be it a specific element. I don't know if it's a fire dragon. The town needs to be a lot of fire. Like every street corner has braziers with old fireplaces that are not lit anymore, probably. Or still lit, maybe, because magic. That type of stuff.
Yeah, and regarding that, I think is a good thing to keep in mind when creating a dungeon itself, or a dungeon crawl, to have reoccurring themes that also represent something in the main storyline itself. Because as everything in a TTRPGs, a dungeon crawl should also tell a story.
Yeah.
That is obviously also decided by the players which story they want to tell, but also on what type of dungeon you are having. And then having that reoccurring themes, not just in visuals or gameplay mechanics, but also in comparison to the campaign themes itself.
Yeah. When we're talking about these themes, right, they should kind of a little bit oppose them, maybe even. They should be felt. I think the best way to make them felt is by making them opposing to what else is about the campaign. Your campaign is about exploring understanding and stopping the resurrection of the ancient dragon race, correct?
Something like that, yeah.
So obviously these cities are a lot about these dragon lords. They are glorifying them, right? The players might see these dragons as a terror, but in these cities, they are obviously not.
Yeah.
So the players should find depictions of glory, of victory, of whatever, right? But it should oppose the players to this normal terror-y fear, whatever, of the dragon race. Whatever motivates them to stop it from happening should be turned on its head of, well, in this part of the world or in this time period of the world that you're exploring right now, that isn't the case.
In general, just you can also keep it as a visual theme for your dungeon, because visuals are important.
Yeah.
If you are descriptive, or you should be descriptive, especially in a dungeon crawl, to make it more interesting, because you aren't in the open world. You can't just, the players can't just go wherever. They have a confined space, and therefore to keep it more interesting, I think, at least for my players in general, is to be a bit more descriptive of the rooms. Like you said, writing down different descriptions and then correlating that to the themes as well can help to keep it interesting and keep it enticing for the players to keep exploring the dungeon.
Yeah, it's all about knowing your group and also obviously playing to your DMing strength. If your DMing strength is descriptive, evocative room descriptions or descriptions in general, obviously you should play that into your dungeon crawl. Your rooms should evoke feelings in the players. If that's what you're good at, do that. But at the same time, someone can say, yeah, this is a prison room. While the evocative DM might go, this is a room. There are iron bars everywhere. There are little cells. The cells are moldy, old, and it still reeks of disgusting, rotten flesh as people have been left down here. You see a skeleton clinging to the iron bars as if the last action this prisoner took was trying to get out. Even if you don't see the faces anymore, you can see the fear. You feel the fear from the skeletons, right? That's different. Even though both rooms are describing a prison room, and both are okay, depending on what you're good at as a DM or what you want to do as a DM even more. If you do not want to make that long descriptions, you don't have to, right? Maybe your DMing strength is combat. It's running these dangerous, surprising and whatever combats. And this prison, you say, this is a prison room. You see if your skeletons, blah, 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 blah. And then the players walk through these rows of iron bars and suddenly all skeletons jump to life and try to claw at them through the iron bars. Hey, two different DMing strengths, both valid, both can be used for dungeon crawls or for dungeons. And I think every DM has strength that they can use in a dungeon, right? Because dungeons are so broadly defined, whatever you count as a dungeon, you can probably bring in your expertise as a DM. If your expertise is playing NPCs, fill your dungeons with NPCs. Then don't make long forgotten tombs of old, but make temples of ancient gods where priests still live and still worship these ancient gods in their cult or whatever.
Yeah, or in the city, for example, the mansion of a lord, and have servants everywhere that your players can interact with.
Yeah.
And this can give you or your players more information, or the information that you wanted them to get through the dungeon, but through different means. Rather than having a book at the end, have the reward be a collection of the things your NPCs told them, for example, because also rewards, I think, are a big part in dungeon crawls.
Yeah, I think dungeons generally should have a reward because they're a thing to go through.
Exactly.
They're a thing to experience, and sometimes that experience is a crawl that takes a long time. So you should have some reward. And I think obviously there isn't a rule for how long the dungeon crawl should be and then how much you should reward your players for it, right? There isn't a formula for that. But make the reward always worth it, because that's the way to motivate your players to do dungeon crawls again. If your reward is not worth it, they're gonna attach that negative experience of, wow, cool, what a cool reward, thank you, to the dungeon crawl, and it's not gonna seem worth it. And that's a big negative if you do want to run more dungeon crawls and your rewards are not worth it.
Exactly.
Sometimes your rewards can be a little bit more obscure, obviously. Instead of gold and magic items, it could be a lot of information. But your players need to feel like, oh, this was worth it. Because if they feel like this was worth it, they are gonna go more into that direction. They're gonna enjoy that direction more.
Exactly. And I just thought of one thing that I found interesting that you could define as a dungeon crawl, basically, is in a non-hostile way.
Sure.
Is some sort of social gathering, some sort of banquet or whatever in the mansion of a lord. Lord, because you're where you have never been before, but were invited because of reasons.
Yeah.
Because you have the unknown part. You don't know shit about the Mansion of the Lord. And you have the extended period of time, basically, with the duration of the banquet, and then can, for example, play to your strength when you create a good NPC, or you're good at playing NPCs. You will have a ballpark in that. It's just easy for you because there are so many NPCs that you can play.
Yeah.
And the reward could be either information, or your players would be able to sway some sort of noble there towards their cause. And the boss fight, in quotation marks, or the climax of that dungeon crawl could be the big social debate that was planned for that.
I find it interesting because, right, the thing you just said is, right, that's a dungeon crawl. And I would agree that could be counted as a dungeon crawl, right? I wouldn't necessarily advertise it as such, but I get what you mean. It's kind of a dungeon. You have big closed up environment with a lot of different challenges in them where it's about exploring, where it's about going further, where it's about uncovering mysteries, the unknown, and that type of stuff. So yeah, it could be a dungeon crawl. The traps shouldn't be an acid pit or whatever, but obviously maybe a spy that roams around and tries to seed deceit or something. That could be a trap in quotation marks, or a puzzle, right? Finding the spy at this noble banquet.
Yeah, it is just possible to say that this is a dungeon crawl because of the loose definition of dungeons.
Yeah.
And traps and puzzles. Because this is the beauty of this loose definition, because you can use everything like that depending on your strength and the things you want to do.
But what I wanted to talk about is that you said there's a big climax to it. And I think that is very good for dungeons because they should escalate, at least a little bit, right? Boss fights at the end of dungeons are the easiest escalation for that. But obviously, if you think about most dungeons in video games and other things, and most normal definition of dungeon, the underground prison structure or the underground brick mortar structure that someone has built to defend something. Obviously, the entrance is maybe gonna be protected, but if there is an inner sanctum, especially a holy site inside this temple, that is gonna be a little bit more protected. The boss fight, right? And the reward is obviously that then after the escalation has come, there's a reward. But they should escalate. They shouldn't necessarily start slow, but they should escalate in any type of way. Be it danger, be it information the players get, right? The importance of the information the players get, because as soon as the players have the important information or have the reward they want, they can go. They don't have to go further into the dungeon if they don't want to. So there should be some escalation to it, I think, that either climaxes in a boss fight or something, or climaxes in something, but it doesn't have to. But if there's an escalation to it, the crawl seems a little bit more interesting. And it's also a thing about pacing. You can pace your crawls. Your players do not have the time to take a long rest because of the escalation. I don't know, it's a race. They need to be the first in the middle of the dungeon because otherwise someone else is gonna get the treasure or something. Whatever, right? But there is some sort of escalation. There's some sort of tension there that is felt, that is driving the players forward to go deeper into the dangerous place they're in. Be that dangerous in form of mortal life or of failing a mission in a social environment, for example. But there's some sort of drive forward.
And I think another thing that should be clear for dungeon crawls is the goal for that dungeon crawl regarding that escalation. Because whatever the goal was for the dungeon crawl, you have other tools to use to escalate the situation itself. If your goal is to simply get to the middle of the dungeon first, you could use other tools to escalate the situation than rather finding out information on a social in a social setting. Because then you can, for the social setting, you can have a spy or an assassin that tries to assassinate your source of information. But in a race, you could have a rapidly changing environment that changes more and more drastic basically every second that you're in this dungeon, and therefore creating a fast-paced environment. Or just, hey, our patrols never came back, so we send out more and more and more and more. If you have a more combat-focused goal in that. If you want to have just clear out this dungeon.
Yeah, your players should have a goal going into them, but there should also be a goal for you as the GM, I think, that also is attached to that. The goal of the dungeon crawl for you as the GM is to, sometimes it's just to challenge your players. That can very much be. The dungeon should be very challenging. Obviously, every dungeon is challenging in some way, but if your goal for this dungeon is to make your players sweat for everything, make a lot of dangerous traps, make a lot of dangerous fights, but make your goal clear to yourself in the beginning, because that is going to heavily influence the theme of the dungeon. and the way you build the dungeon, I think. Because if you do not have that goal, it becomes, how do I do that? Well, and then the dungeon feels inconsistent. It's about consistency a lot with dungeons for me.
Exactly.
With a goal that you have, with a purpose, right? When we're talking about building them, it's about purpose and themes and being consistent in those. Or at least changing up those themes, right? Is also consistency. But it isn't supposed to be incoherent, right? Yeah. A dungeon that is broken up by a lava flow because it's been old and underground and there is a lava flow makes sense. But a dungeon that is broken up by, I don't know, I don't have any idea. But the dungeon that is broken up by something that is not really consistent or just, right? You don't have to make that lava flow break up just because you want to.
Yeah, for example, in a sky castle, that might not be the best idea.
That is not a good idea, right? Because where is that lava coming from?
Exactly. But if there is a reason that you established through other things in the dungeon, it's still coherent and consistent.
Yeah. If the sky castle is also a broken place, maybe there's just a rift into nothingness because they would fall down or something. So you can still make that, but it has to be coherent and consistent with what you established beforehand. And if you have a goal for your dungeon, right, you as a GM have a goal. This dungeon is supposed to be challenging my players, or this dungeon is supposed to give my players a lot of information. That helps you create a better theme for the dungeon, which helps you create a better dungeon, which helps you create a better dungeon crawl.
Exactly.
So have a goal, have a theme, then create a good dungeon, and then with that, create a dungeon crawl.
Exactly. And I think, sadly, there is no boiled down way to say how to build a dungeon crawl because it heavily depends on the things you just said.
Yeah.
Because it's so individual and depending on the goal completely changes everything. How you should build the dungeon crawl and the dungeon itself and the setting and blah, blah, blah. All of that is sadly, because I know I personally struggled a lot with it at first to build a dungeon crawl or a good dungeon crawl, and I kind of then stuck to most of the time to the 5-room dungeon thing. Not necessarily for creating the dungeon, but as a guideline for creating a dungeon crawl, that you first have to somehow enter the structure, the dungeon itself, then have some sort of puzzle, or it might even be just a roleplay puzzle or a roleplay interaction of some sort that maybe sets the specific theme or another theme or changes stuff or whatever. Then some sort of setback, usually. It could also be a puzzle, it could also be a combat, it could be a trap, it could be many different kinds of things. Then the climax, boss fight, blah, blah, whatever. Some sort of high point of tension, and then the reward. And depending on that, I have 5 sections of the dungeon, and then populating those sections felt easier once I have it defined a bit. This just was something that helped me a lot.
I know how it helped you, right? Because it's breaking up, it's dividing and conquering, it's making every step easier. Because as you said, there isn't a defined formula. Everything can be a dungeon, and that just means everyone can build their dungeons differently. And we made an episode on how to build dungeons with a lot of advice on what to create, what to watch out for, what to think about first, and that type of stuff. But obviously we couldn't tell you how to exactly build your dungeons. The 5-room dungeon is a good thing to build dungeon, but it's also not perfect. I'm not saying that the person that proposed the 5-room dungeon has made any wrong, because it's a very helpful tool or it's a very helpful formula. But obviously sometimes I want a dungeon with 6 rooms, even though the 5 rooms they have, right? Entrance has to be there, having a puzzle room, having a combat room, having loot attached to something, and having a climax or whatever, all very much needed. But sometimes my dungeons also will include obviously very specific rooms to that dungeon that could not fit into the dungeon. 5-room dungeon couldn't fit in there. Sometimes, for example, in one of my dungeons there's a teleportation room or a corridor with a lot of different teleportation rooms because they need to teleport everywhere quick. What is that exactly out of the 5-room dungeon? Because it's a very important room for my adventure and my dungeon, but it's not an entrance, it's not a combat, it's not a riddle, it's also definitely no loot or climax or something. It's literally just an information room. And yeah, there is kind of lore and mystery and information attached to it, so it fits in the 5-room dungeon, but it's not really a room where I give a lot to my players. But later on, through the climax, for example, they might find information on how to use the teleportation circles in these rooms. And then the dungeon becomes part of the 5-room dungeon, right? And that's the thing. Sometimes you just have to wing your dungeons. Gonna say that. Sometimes you will have to just dig through it, create a lot of rooms for your dungeon, create a lot of things for your dungeon, and just do it. Yes, that can be tedious work. I'm not gonna lie. But oftentimes, in my opinion, it's worth it to create a great dungeon for your players. Because even the most dungeon-opposed players, and I have one of them at my tables, enjoy a very well rigid, defined dungeon where everything seems to make sense and plays to the strength of the party and to the GM's strength.
Yeah, because most dungeon-opposed players didn't have that great of examples of dungeons that were fit for them, cater to the needs of your party or your players. And therefore you can just create dungeons that fit everyone, or fit some dungeons that fit everyone or this specific person or whatever, to make it feel interesting, because it's just basically a dungeon is just an environment for you to use. And how dungeon opposed you are, a great environment is as and always will be a great environment. If it's a great environment for you, obviously, but a great environment stays a great environment, whatever the description of that environment might be. And that could also be obviously a dungeon, even if your player might not like dungeon crawls as a thing itself. But if you make it an exploration or a mystery thing, that might change the thing completely.
I think that wraps kind of up the discussion about dungeon crawls and dungeons and how to run them. Remember, it's really just about what the dungeon is supposed to do for you as a group. Find out what the goals are, if you want to find out more about how to build dungeons, listen to our episode on that, or find articles online. There are many great ones. But generally, when it comes to dungeon crawls and running dungeons, find out the goal for the dungeon, create themes, and then just go for it. Because dungeons are something for me that I just learned by doing very much. I learn a lot by doing. But dungeons were one thing where I couldn't read about how to do them good, because the only advice that really always helped is, it's your dungeon, make the best of it. Use your DM strength, think of themes and goals, and then just do it. Because any other advice is too specific to fit your dungeon, probably.
Exactly.
If someone says make a lot of hard combats, doesn't work for some people's dungeons, so don't use that advice. But what always works is thinking about the goals, making it kind of rigid, and then going for it.
Yeah.
That's the advice for dungeons. So, Niels, please, you have the last word for today.
Yeah, and as per usual, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at DoubleDMPod, or you could also visit our website at www.doubledm.com. We also have a Ko-Fi if you would like to check that out. And if you like this show, please leave a review on your favorite podcast listening platform of your choice. And with that, thank you all for listening. Hear you on the next one, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.